Please take your seats quickly, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you.
Hi guys, and welcome to 1minutetennis.com. In today's session, I want to talk to you with great precision about the last contact between you and the racket, and then the racket with the ball. And that's the wrist position. I want to show you how you can create a stable and strong wrist position to give you better consistency, better power, and an easier forehand. The wrist position can be very confusing because the angle of the racket can be substantially different depending on what forehand we want to create and the height of contact with the ball. So if I'm playing the ball where I want to hit a great deal of topspin, then the racket is substantially below my arm and hand. If I want to hit flatter, then the racket is just slightly below the hand or even level. If there's a high ball, then very often the racket is above the hand and then drops to be level with the hand. And so the natural thing to assume is that the wrist is going to break downwards into ulnar deviation, that's this position here, when I want the racket to go lower and create that heavy topspin. But if we dive a little bit deeper and look at the anatomy of the wrist, then we have extension, flexion, ulnar deviation, and radial deviation. Radial deviation is the smallest of the movements. Now, the strongest of the movements is extension. Flexion is relatively weak, and then we have radial deviation, which is very small, and the weakest movement by far is ulnar deviation. If I allow my wrist to ulnar deviate with a racket in it, then the racket is now pulling my wrist in an out of control position. So the reality is that ulnar deviation wants to be avoided as much as possible within the forehand stroke. We have extension and we have radial deviation, laying the wrist back and then pulling the wrist upwards. But we do not want ulnar deviation where the wrist drops down. But that brings about a reasonable question. How do we get the racket substantially below the contact with the ball if we're not going to ulnar deviate? And the answer is that the wrist has no role in that position. It's the supination of the forearm that drops the racket lower, and the wrist stays in an extended to neutral position. Let's look at the difference between the two movements. So now I'm in position here, I take the racket back and I ulnar deviate to get the racket to drop. Here, ulnar deviation and swing. And I can feel a substantial recoil and pressure on the wrist as the wrist drops into an ulnar deviated position. But if I leave the wrist in extension and now simply turn the forearm up to the sky, supination, now I have a stable and strong wrist, and yet I have the position of the racket substantially below the predicted or anticipated contact point to come up into the ball. So ulnar deviation, unstable, and extension and supination and stable. This makes a tremendous difference if the ball is coming to you very quickly or if you're swinging with great speed trying to create a lot of power and spin. So remember, extension and then no ulnar deviation. Just turn the arm upwards to the sky. This is often disguised in the pro players because most of them have such extreme grips. If I go to a full Western grip and now make the same motion, it looks like a wrist position because the racket is still closed. If I go to an Eastern grip and now have the extended wrist and supinate, then the racket starts to open. You saw this a few years ago in Del Potro, where he appeared to have an open racket on the takeback. But in actual fact, he had the same angle as all of the other players. It's just that his grip was an Eastern grip, unlike the extreme grips of most of his contemporaries. Finding this perfect wrist position is difficult for a lot of players. If it was natural, then it wouldn't be that so many of the people watching this video have an incorrect wrist position on the forehand. The extension is fairly natural, but the radial deviation coming up and over the ball is less natural. A good way of thinking of this and actually applying it to your game is to think about pointing the thumb down at the end of the forehand. So I make the stroke here, I swing, and I make sure that the thumb is pointing down. When I point the thumb down, then I naturally create a radial deviation movement. So I have extension and radial deviation, an extension and radial deviation, an extension and radial deviation. By understanding and applying extension and radial deviation to the wrist movement and removing ulnar deviation, then you have a very stable feel within the stroke. And this allows most players to actually expand the racket lag and hit with more power and more authority. By understanding and applying extension and radial deviation to the wrist movement and removing ulnar deviation, then you have a very stable feel within the stroke. And this allows most players to actually expand the racket lag and hit with more power and more authority. So avoid ulnar deviation, make sure that your racket is stable because the wrist is in its strongest possible position, and you'll have a bigger, better and easier forehand today. If you like this or any other of our ideas on tennis, then check out our books. We have books on every aspect of the game, and the books are broken down into the biomechanics and science of the strokes, and then we have super simple illustrated solutions such as this. Everything is designed to help you be the best tennis player you can be. Or join players in over 40 countries that I'm helping with online coaching. For more information on either of these, check out the website or email me. So use with precision the wrist position of the best forehands in the world. Drop the wrist into extension and then pull it into radial deviation, and you'll have a bigger and better forehand. Thanks for watching, and see you next time for more unique tennis lessons that really work.